Received from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and a master's from the Rosenstiel of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Miami, and she received her Bachelor of Arts at Mount Holyoke College. Dr. Mansfield's research interests include sea turtle and other marine vertebrate movements, migration, and habitat utilization. Dr. Mansfield's recent projects include testing and deploying small-scale solar-powered satellite tags on young sea turtles with the goal of describing early sea turtle dispersal and habitat use. Dr. Mansfield, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm embarrassed to say that I've lived in Orlando for 5 years and I've never been to Blue Gardens, and it's absolutely beautiful, so I need to come back this weekend, I think. But thank you again for inviting me, and I am the new director of the UCF Marine Turtle Research Group. I was hired by UCF in 2013 to take over a very long-term, multi-decadal project that has been out at the coast and a presence in Florida for the better part of 30, 40 years. So what I'll do tonight is introduce you a little bit to the different aspects of the UCF Marine Turtle Research Group. I'm going to start with some of our coastal work and coastal activities, but then I'm going to focus on the offshore work that we do and looking at the movements and the behavior of what's known as the sea turtle lost years. And the sea turtle lost years are aptly named because they're the little tiny babies, the ones that leave our nesting beaches as tiny little hatchlings that might be about half the size of the palm of my hand. And they spend an unknown period of time offshore, anywhere from 2 to 4 to 6 years at least, before they come back to coastal habitats like places like the Indian River Lagoon or other places like the Chesapeake Bay up in Virginia and a lot of different coastal bays and sounds up and down the East Coast. Oops. I think what I see on my screen is very different from what is up there, so I just want to make sure that I can see my PowerPoint here. Let's see. It works. Doesn't work on here, but hey. So the sea turtle life history and the sea turtle life cycle is fairly complex, and it's very similar in some ways to humans. We don't know how long sea turtles live. We think that they live at least as long as humans, so they may live at least 70 to 80 to 90 years before they die. We do know that they're very late maturing animals, which means that they can't reproduce and put back into their population for upwards of 20 to 30 years. It's kind of estimated around 25, age 25 to 35 for some species. So that imagine humans who hit puberty around age 11, 12, 13 in there. It's almost twice as old as humans for sea turtles before they hit that maturity point where then they can reproduce, lay eggs, or at least for the females, and contribute to the building up their populations. So sea turtles have to live upwards of 2 to 3 decades in the wild and survive all the things that we as humans do in coastal waters, fishing activities, dredging activities. They have to survive natural predators. They have to just survive plastics in the ocean. They have to survive so many different things before they can then contribute to their population. And sea turtles will nest in places up and down the East Coast. They are especially known in Florida, and about 90% of all the loggerhead, which is one particular type of species that we see most commonly in Florida waters, but the loggerhead sea turtle, about 90% of all loggerhead nesting in the Atlantic occurs in Florida, which is pretty cool. I mean, Florida is a very special place when it comes to sea turtles. And for green turtles and leatherbacks, 2 other species that we see in our area, they nest mostly from central Florida south into the Caribbean and other places in Central and South America. But for Florida, where we have our hot spot of turtle activity, it is actually on the UCF beaches. or what I call the UCF beaches. It's Central Florida's coast. And we monitor about 50 kilometers of beach. UCF has been monitoring this stretch of beach for upwards of 35 to 40 years. And I'll show you a little bit more detail on that in a second. But with regards to sea turtle life history, they're really interesting animals because they require both land, terrestrial habitat, and marine habitat. They require coastal habitat, they require offshore habitat. And they are incredible migrators. You know, a lot like birds in some ways, and I'm not much of a bird person. I know this is the Audubon Society, but there's a lot of common ground between some of these sea turtles and bird migrations. And what is especially amazing is that little tiny animals and young sea turtles can migrate up to thousands and thousands of kilometers just in a few months. We have adults that may migrate similarly thousands of kilometers within a season. So sea turtles are highly migratory, they're late maturing, they're long-lived animals, all of which combined makes it really difficult for these populations to survive and thrive over time, given that it takes so long for them to hit maturity to put back into their population, and it takes so long for those populations to recover from human activities. So all up and down especially the east coast of the Florida Atlantic coast, we have a lot of really important sea turtle nesting habitat. And on that nesting habitat, we have little hatchlings emerging from nests that are laid by the adult females that come ashore to lay their eggs during the spring, summer, and into the fall months. And the hatching occurs usually from midsummer through the fall and sometimes into the end of the year. We'll have, on our beaches, we'll have thousands of nests that are laid, and from those nests we have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of little hatchlings that are all swimming into the ocean and trying to make their way into the offshore habitats. But this whole process, and what happens is those little babies will spend, we don't know how long, maybe several years offshore. Eventually they get large enough where they can no longer be supported by available habitat and available food and resources for them offshore. They'll eventually make their way back into coastal habitats as larger juveniles. And if you remember, those little baby hatchlings, when they leave those nesting beaches, they're only about half the size of my palm. When they come back into coastal habitats, depending upon the species, they may be as big as the seats that you're sitting on, or maybe as big as a dinner plate, or maybe a little bit bigger than the cooler top out there if you happen to check it out on your way out. And the turtles themselves will then alter their habitat or alter their behavior. They'll be feeding off of bottom-dwelling organisms. They'll change their diets. They will then recruit eventually to adult habitats as they mature into adults. And then they'll take seasonal migrations to the nesting beaches. And it's thought that sea turtles do return to their natal beaches. That they have very strong philopatry or natal philopatry to those beaches that they emerged from decades ago as tiny little hatchlings. And in a perfect world, when we're looking at a species, when we're trying to understand what an animal does, where it goes, where and how it reproduces, and how long it takes for them to reach maturity, how long it takes for them to hit senescence, which is the equivalent of menopause in humans. There's so much that we need to know about an animal and about all aspects of its life in order to protect them, in order to conserve them, in order to understand how we as humans might be behaving in a way that may not be very helpful for their populations. How can we mitigate our activities to minimize our impact on the species? And with sea turtles, in an ideal world, we would know every little bit of information. So it's almost like a large patchwork quilt where you have all the different pieces of information about the sea turtle life that we would stitch together to form a bit of a quilt to give us an idea of how we can conserve, how we can protect the animals. But the reality is that because these are very long-lived animals, because they are very late maturing, and because they spend a large portion of their lives in very different places, thousands of kilometers from where they may have originated from, we have what we kind of consider as a patchwork quilt that has a lot of holes in it that we are still trying to fill. And it's a bit like bobbing for apples blindfolded. Often we don't know where to sample in the vast ocean to find some of the younger turtles. We don't know a lot about just basic things that, how fast do they grow? When do they change their diets? When do they start their migrations and end their migrations? Why are they doing it? Is it because the temperatures are changing? Is it because of photoperiod differences, between spring and summer and fall? There are a lot of questions that we just don't know. And as a result, sea turtles mostly remain animals that are both federally protected under the Endangered Species Act, but they're also internationally of concern. They're considered critically endangered or endangered in most parts of the world. And sea turtles are found all over the place. They are globally distributed. We don't find them in the very extreme poles of Earth. We don't find them in the North Pole. We don't find them in the South Pole, in the Arctic and Antarctic regions, in part because it's too cold. These are cold-blooded animals. They can't survive those terribly cold areas, but they are found globally distributed just about everywhere else. So imagine all of these patchwork quilts all over the world that have varying holes in them based on how much we may know in a particular area versus places that are a little bit less studied or less understood. And so we have a lot of holy blankets out there, essentially, that we are working very hard to try to fill, but because these animals are such long-lived, late-maturing, highly migratory animals, it's difficult to fill those data gaps. And part of the reason for this is because we are human. We have our own biases and our own kind of limitations. We are I want to argue that we're very two-dimensional creatures in that we have to walk on kind of the ground. We can't just lift up and fly around in a three-dimensional habitat. We can swim, but we're kind of tied to the surface of the ocean because we have to breathe. And we can use technology to allow us to access different realms, but for limited periods of time. So we don't, for us, it's very easy to go to a nesting beach and walk along that beach or drive an all-terrain vehicle up and down the beach and count how many nests are laid. And we can count sometimes, if we're lucky to have access to a beach at night, we can count how many females, individuals that are coming up to lay their eggs. We can mark them. We don't band them like you do birds, but we can put flipper tags on them. We can put pit tags on them, passive integrated transponders, where we're able to kind of scan them eventually, and we'll be able to identify individuals that come back to nest every few years, every 2 years, 3 years. We can record how many nests each individual female may lay, how many eggs are in each nest, how many little hatchlings emerge from those nests and then make their way offshore. But it's very tied to the beach. And kind of historically, the humans, us, scientists, have been very tied to collecting most of our sea turtle information from nesting beaches. And it makes sense. It's easy. And it's not very expensive. Logistically, it's a little bit easier. You can just walk along the beach. You can drive an ATV, and that's it. And you get a good idea of what the reproductive output is of particular populations. However, it doesn't tell us a lot about all the other time that they spend in the open ocean, which is the vast majority of their lives. So really looking at just beach data, which historically we as sea turtle scientists have done, unfortunately, we're very biased in that, and we've only had a real small snapshot of the overall life history of these animals by being so dependent on the beaches. Now, sea turtles are also long-lived, late-maturing animals, and in a way, I call it slow science, because we need to know how many nests are laid on the beaches year after year after year. But a sea turtle generation time might be 25 to 35 years. That equates to about one research professor's career. And that's a picture of Doc Earhart, Lou Earhart, who is my predecessor. Some of you may have may remember him. I think he was on the board maybe of the Orange County Society at some point. And he retired back in 2004, but still remained active with the program. I was hired in 2013 and took over the project from him. But he started the project back in the late 1970s and really got it going in the early 1980s. So from the 1980s until the 2000s, that's about one turtle generation time. And when he retires, I try to pick his brain as much as possible. I get my grad students to hang out with him on a boat. When we're sampling, he comes out with us still. And we try to absorb some of that information, but there's a lot of institutional knowledge, there's a lot of beach-based knowledge that he has that when he retires may be lost. So with sea turtles, we have this kind of weird issue with shifting baselines and perhaps losing some of our perspective when people retire, or only thinking about what we see in our data sets for the lifetime of our careers. We also have issues with encounter bias. And as I mentioned, these turtles will travel thousands of kilometers far offshore. But we're humans, and it's a lot easier for us to walk on a beach or to get in a boat and maybe take a day trip offshore. It may be really easy for us to fly to some exotic island like the Azores or the Canary Islands or Cape Verde in that area and take a boat a little farther offshore. But to go into the middle of the ocean, it's a lot harder, a lot more expensive, and you really have to have a strong stomach to survive the seas out there. So our encounter of these animals is kind of biased by our human limitations and kind of the logistics of it and the cost of it. That's another factor that plays into those big data gaps that we have in those big patchwork quilts that I described. And you guys are familiar with the bird world, and you know that some birds experience the world very, very, very differently than we do. And as humans, we can hear, we can smell, we can taste, we can touch. But some animals experience the world incredibly differently from us. And as humans, again, we're these arrogant scientists who think that we're studying things as they should be and as we experience the world around us. But we sometimes forget that animals might have capabilities that we don't. And it turns out that sea turtles can pick up on the Earth's magnetic field. They're able to, some sea turtles have an innate magnetic compass and an innate map that allows them to understand where they are in the world based on the Earth's magnetic field. And some birds have that capability. Some birds, and we are starting to wonder whether sea turtles can also experience and see polarized light. We don't see that. Just like bees are able to see UV signatures on flowers, we don't experience the world in the same way that a lot of animals do. And that's something that we have to take into consideration. So there's a lot that I would argue that we don't know about many animals, and sea turtles especially, because we haven't thought outside of our human box a little bit. And finally, we do have a bit of an ocean bias when it comes to studying sea turtles. A lot of work has been done in the North Atlantic. Not as much has been done in other parts of the world. So part of that is due to where the funding is, where the interest is, where the turtles might be more accessible. But overall, a lot of work has been done in the North Atlantic, but in other places, it kind of waxes and wanes based on availability or of funding or accessibility to the animals.